Can I make this video less than 30 minutes? We shall see, because I want to recommend 25 science fiction things that fall into like 10 sort of categories I put together, because this is the year of science fiction. And what I mean by that is last year I noticed that I really didn't read a lot of science fiction, and this year I wanted to read more. And I have been reading more, and I wanted to recommend a bunch of the stuff that I've been reading in cool categories and other things I've read in the past, and like kind of maybe also point out what might be good like jumping in points for people who are like, I never know where to start with science fiction, which is kind of why I have a bunch of categories. So if you know what you like in other genres, maybe this is a good like, oh, this is adjacent to something I like, I can hop in here, that sort of thing. But something I always am hesitant about in terms of like beginner guides videos is like, go for the ideas that fascinate you, because what is beginners for someone might be intermediate for another, and vice versa. And at the end of the day, you're going to like a story if it interests you, and you will put in the work if it's actually confusing, if there's other things there. Like, and also, you're going to be more capable of consuming these stories than you think. I feel like science fiction is a scarier genre for people who don't read it than other things, even though especially if you're a fantasy reader. And if you watch my channel, you're probably a fantasy reader. You're good with world building. You got this. So I will point out what I think is maybe more quote-unquote entry level, but follow your heart. Also, some of the more traditional heavy hitters, like, say, The Martian or stuff like that, I won't have on my list. I think I've mentioned it in another video at some point. But also, I've basically pulled from what I've been reading the last couple years, like basically since the last time I made a sci-fi recommendation video. And I'd like to highlight things, even if I don't love them, that, people don't talk about all the time. So you can really try and find some of the fun science fiction gems that are out there. So, already used 2 minutes. Let us get into it, starting with what I'm calling the adventure category. My standalone pick is Where Peace is Lost. This is also incredibly accessible to people who like Horizon Zero Dawn. Any of the tech mumbo-jumbo that you'll find in this one, you can just imagine the mechs from that video game and it'll work just as well. And it has a lot of classic, I think, fantasy archetypes and sci-fi archetypes. We got reluctant heroes with mysterious past. We have a found family. We're going on a travel quest to accomplish a task. It's got a lot of, I think, comfort there. And it's a fun standalone with a good audiobook. I also have one that's a trilogy. And this one I think is actually a really good, like I think adventure science fiction and fantasy, there's a lot of overlap. But Velocity Weapon is the first in its trilogy, which I don't know if it's called the Velocity Weapon. No, it's the Protectorate trilogy. This is multi-POV, so it kind of feels good if you like multi-POV fantasy. And in general, it's got that good balance of this is a quick moving plot, we've got things to do, we're getting reveals left and right, and you're able to get attached to your cast of characters. They are actually people with issues who go through arcs, they're not too surface level, and I feel like that's just like a very comfortable thing we see a lot of the times in multi-POV fantasy. It's a very fun time, highly recommend. And then my last adventure one is the Verkosigan Saga. I just really like this one. My selling points for this is, do you want to see where tropes kind of have evolved from? Because this has been written since the 80s. Very fun. I find that fascinating. They're also largely at the beginning episodic. I don't know if that changes later on, but so far for me, things have been episodic, so you can have all the perks of a long, sprawling series without feeling the need to be like, oh, I have to read all these back to back or else I'm going to forget everything. That hasn't happened to me so far, at least, and I've been reading it for over a year now. And then also they're short. So far, at least the beginning books, they're all like 300, 350 pages, if that. They're short, and I think she has a very engaging writing style and like brings you in by getting you to care about the characters. And obviously, when you care about the characters first, it doesn't even matter how weird the world or the cultures are, because you already have buy-in. So I really like all of those. I think all of those are accessible to anyone who thinks those projects are really fun. My next one, maybe some of these should come with some caveats, and this is like my big political world-building focused science fictions. Like if you're reading science fiction because you want to see someone craft a new world with different politics and the tension is within the politics, okay, here we go. The first one that I think is ironically the most accessible, even though it's technically like the 5th book in some world series, but I don't think you need to read the other books first. And this is Translation State. This is, I think, the most accessible of this type that I'm showing because you're focusing on characters and their character development in really cool worlds. Like the cool worlds are the backdrop. And it is really fun figuring out, wow, how are they using gender to talk? And what are these different species? And what's this economic system that they're using? And the actual tension is around this treaty that needs to be formed between, I the human species and this kind of other alien species. And because it is so character focused, I feel it's way more accessible. The trilogy that this world starts with is Ancillary Justice. And I like but don't love that book. I think Translation State is amazing and can be read as a standalone, especially if you have no interest in reading like a trilogy and then another standalone book. You can read this one on your own. Like, it's completely fine. Especially if you're just like, I want a taste of some really fun, unique world building, but I still want to actually be focused on characters and their internal struggles. This is a very good one. Another one where I'm just like, the world. Woo. The Sentinel Cycle by Malka Older. So this starts with Infomocracy. This is a world where basically every 100,000 people, there's a different government that they vote on. And it's really tied to Infomocracy. It's kind of like their Google or something like that. And every book is kind of like a sci-fi thriller. So kind of like a, I don't know, Mission Impossible type style movie, but in a book. So sometimes these weren't like my favorite things. And I do have a should you read for the trilogy if you want to know more. But like in terms of like a future world political system, and all these are political sci-fi thrillers, I was like, wow. This is so fascinating, how the tech works, how it can be manipulated or not manipulated, the fact that you could just cross a line and you're in another place and there are different rules for the ads that can come into your feed. How normal it felt with also feeling like such a visitor in a strange world. Very cool. Similar to this, but one that's like worked more for me in terms of enjoyment has been the Terra Ignota series so far. This is another book where like we are really imagining a very different type of future. We don't have borders again. And I think I'm drawn to science fiction that doesn't have borders. I'm just like, yeah, what does that look like? Because we are so tied to geographic borders, right? Like that's a huge part of identity, is what country lines, state lines, city lines you live in. It's very geographically tied. So remove the geography. What does bind a person? And what do those political systems look like, and how do they deal with conflict? Terra Ignota. Now, both this and the Sentinel Cycles, they are going to be work, I feel, because of the writing style, because of the unique world building, because we don't have a lot of language for it. But, like, I think it's worth it. I think the Sentinel Cycle, it does have that, like, action thriller, sci-fi movie sort of thing going for it. So, like, it has that as a fallback. The Sentinel Cycle, for the most part, I find that if it doesn't work for people, it's more of a writing style disconnect, unless that the world building is so confusing. My next one, it also still has cool world building, but there's also like a murder mystery. Like it's political tension, but murder mystery. So if you need or want a murder mystery, like if that's your comfort zone, I wanted to bring that up. We got the Texcalon duology, where the first book is a classic murder mystery, fish out of water. Ambassador shows up to see that their predecessor has been killed. What happened? I love the Texcalon duology. And the second book is playing around with a lot of different science fiction tropes. I think this one is not necessarily bad for beginners at all, but it is very slow paced. So if you associate science fiction with denser books, this is going to meet that expectation. So if you don't want a denser, slower paced experience, and I say that even though the plot of this book actually takes place, I think, over like 48 to 72 hours, but it definitely feels like a slower paced read. I love it. The second book is faster paced, but that would be my only thing here. Murder mystery that is shorter is the Massa and Pleiadi duology. This is also by Malka Older, and you get some fascinating world building on how you live on Jupiter. But these are your classic Holmesian detective stories. Massa and Pleiadi are basically Holmes and Watson. They are second chance friends, lovers, and on Jupiter there are these mysteries, and they are tied to politics and figuring out how did these things happen. Next category, we're just going straight action-packed thriller. And I don't actually love any of these because I'm just not a thriller person, but thrillers, fast-paced things, it's an easy way to really get into a genre, I feel. So let's start with one that's more like lit-ficky, or at least I see it more in lit-fic circles, probably because it's a translation. This is The Anomaly. I read this in a day, and it's 400 pages. So you want something fast-paced? Here you go. It's multi-POV. You're not going to get a lot of character development, but it's kind of multimedia at times. And it plays with a classic sci-fi trope that I won't bring up in case it's considered a spoiler. I don't really care. I don't think it is, but I won't bring it up. But it's a very interesting thriller story where people go on a plane, it crashes, and when they come back to the world, it's not quite the same. And why? It's very interesting. Another one is The Deep Sky. We read this at the beginning of the year. And this is a bunch of people who go into space to try and, I think, find a new planet because, of course, we've messed up the world. I think I have a whole science fiction recommendation video that is just, we messed up, and therefore, like, I read a lot of science fiction books playing with those tropes a couple years ago. And this is one of those. And basically, it's like a closed circle mystery thriller because people are dying on the spacecraft, and it has to be someone that's on board, and why. And there are things to nitpick about the world building in this book. But when I say that I was so invested at the last 2/3 of it, I'm like, who did do it? What is happening? Like, the twists and the turns were engaging. Were the actual reveals worth it? I'm not sure, but I had fun. And if the reveals weren't worth it, they didn't make me mad. So I had a good time with this. It was pretty fast-paced. It definitely focuses on friendship, which I also appreciate. But again, world building, not its strong point. So if you like science fiction for the world building, I can maybe steer you away from this one. But if you like the whole survival in deep space for long-term travel, we got that. And then one that I read recently that I personally did not like, but maybe it's because of the genre. Maybe this would work perfectly for someone else. This is Womb City. So this is dystopian. And I had a tough time figuring out its genre. I'm putting it here because I do think for a different reader, this has a relentless pacing to it, and that might be why I had an issue. So it has a lot of classic dystopian feelings, a misuse of the system. Our main character has this microchip because you can body hop, which is a very cyberpunk type part of science fiction. So you can body hop your consciousness, and they are body hopped into a consciousness that was a criminal body. And when you have a criminal's body, you are responsible for getting checked up to make sure that body doesn't commit criminal acts anymore. And she is also in a marriage that's not going well, and they're trying to have a baby, and then things happen, and I can't really get into it, but there's a countdown clock, okay? So if you like a good countdown plot, and if you like a whole things don't feel right, and you want to feel reveals, and you want to be like, oh my god, I didn't believe this could happen, it does have those. It just didn't land for me because I just don't think I'm the audience for this story, and I didn't necessarily like the blending of genres we got. But I also hesitate to say that it did anything wrong. I just was very done, and I probably should have DNF'd it. So in terms of thriller, if you want to see a lot of common cyberpunk dystopian tropes, but with a different spin on it, definitely a lot of thriller energy. And it takes place in Botswana, and I think like that those parts of it were actually very strong and compelling, and it were like the unique taste to it versus like if this system was set up in the United States or in Europe or something like that. Next up, I have books that I consider like thought experiment books. There's a whole part of science fiction where I feel like you're just given an idea and a situation, and you're just going to think about it, okay? One of them is Children of Time. I feel like people talk about this book all the time, but Children of Time. We have a what if a science experiment goes wrong, and instead of sentient apes, we have sentient spiders. What does that mean? And you get to kind of see the thought experiment flow out. It doesn't have like a plot. You're just seeing the consequences of something set in motion. Similarly, a lot of Octavia Butler falls into this. I'm going to eventually soon have my Octavia Butler video out there. I only have half a short story collection and one more novel to read. But for now, in general, you pick up an Octavia Butler, it's going to fit into this category of, well, what happens in X scenario? Let's just follow it out to some conclusion. And I think that's why a lot of her works are incredibly uncomfortable to people, because they're very human and they're very close to reality, even in the most absurd circumstances, because her way of doing a thought experiment is relentlessly jaded in terms of how people are going to respond to scenarios. And not necessarily harshly either. Like, people for years have been saying how Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents feels prophetic because she wrote them in the 90s and they're taking place in the now and they almost feel like the now. It's like she was just in the 90s looking at humanity and making conclusions based off the past. Like, it's one of those things where we just don't usually do that because it's a sad way to think all the time, right? So she's really great for thought experiments. And then one that I like a lot, and the third book's coming out this year, so I'm excited, Symbiosis and Interference. This is one where people travel to a planet and they are going to live there. And instead of it being like Alien or Aliens and things go wrong or something like that, like this isn't your classic thriller, although it has tension. Like things happen and you're like, it has those like, I'm on the edge of my seat because I don't know if things are going to go well. But it's not really a thriller. It's more like a generational thought experiment science fiction of like, how do these people who land on foreign soil with foreign fauna and plants and everything. How do they coexist with the land? And then how does each generation decide to govern itself? So that's a fascinating thought experiment one. The first one is more like them living there, and the second one is more, oh, what if Earth decides to talk to them again? Next one, these are going to be like experimental science fiction, and this is going to cover 3 very, very different books, but an experimental in terms of writing style, narrative prose, everything like that. One is The Cabinet. This is a Korean translation? I believe it's Korean translation. This is bonkers. This is a bananas book. This is so weird. There's a cabinet with weird stories in it, and you don't know if the stories are true or not. It's weird. It's weird. Like, I still think about it. I don't think it's bad. I gave it 3 stars. It's odd. It's a very odd time. But if you like weird, odd fiction, you should give it a shot and see what you think. See what odd thoughts you have about it. My second one would be Goliath by Tochi Onibuchi. This one is so interesting, and it's nonlinear storytelling, and it's like fragmented characterization. That's why I'm putting it in kind of experimental, because I do think you have to have a lot of patience with the framework and the prose to get a lot out of it. This is one where it's not famously, but for myself, in my head, I famously read this once, struggled, almost DNF'd it, had a rough time, finished it, and was like, oh my god, I see what it was doing, reread it again within a month, and was like, this is fantastic. This is what science fiction is supposed to be doing. Because this is also a thought experiment of, okay, we messed up Earth. People with means left to live on satellites for a while until they can come back. But there are still people left on Earth to live and to maintain the Earth, essentially. And then what happens, they've just been living their life to the best of their ability, not living as well as people on the satellites. Those people are coming back, and they want to live where these other people have been living. What happens? I really love Goliath, but it requires an insane amount of patience because of how he chose to write it. And then Elysium is one I read recently that is basically a computer code that is corrupted telling a story of this planet. And every iteration is similar but slightly different because of this corruption in the file. It's fascinating. So that one, again, is what I consider like a very fun experimental pick, and it's only 200 pages. So it doesn't overstay its welcome. Like, all of these are relatively short, because I feel like when you do experimental things, like if you do it for 500 pages, people are going to get done. These are all at least like 200 to 300 pages. I figured I would put 2 romances on here, even though romance science fiction is not like my big go-to. But we've got Winter's Orbit and Ocean's Echo, both by Verena Maxwell. You could read either one first, but they are in the same world, but different character sets. Winter's Orbit is Marriage of Convenience, and Ocean's Echo, like, it's a romance. That one's probably the more science-y of the two, and it can be a little uncomfortable from what I can remember. I did like it, but I also read it in a pretty bad headspace. But those are 2, and then Hunt the Stars. People have really liked this trilogy. I was only okay with it. It did remind me of fae romance. So if you like fae romance and you wanted to see something in a science fiction world that had similar types of species difference and things like that, I would try this one out. And now we've got my hopeful climate novellas, because I somehow have 2. The first one I've talked a lot about recently, so we'll get that out of the way, and that's Arboreality. Hopeful in quotes. Like, we start this book off with so many wildfires that we are trying to figure out how to keep books, because we're about to go into a dark age for a short period of time, because the climate's, it's doing stuff. We are in a state of collapse. But basically the novella takes place over, I want to say 2 to 3 generations, and by the end of it, you end up in a place that's not necessarily better or more stable, it's just different. There's a different state of coexistence with the land. So there are bittersweet moments, but it's kind of that middle ground of things aren't all depressing. There are consequences to the action of, like, changing the world to the point where this is how the climate works, this is how the wildfires work. This takes place in Vancouver Island. But it also shows that survival and living is possible. And I think that's key. Living is possible even when there is change, even when there's loss and death and destruction. The other one I really like is The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valente. This has Tetley, and Tetley is so cute. They are precocious. I don't even know if they're young. I just think of them as just this, they have such a strong voice in the story. So Tetley lives on this trash pile because we live on trash in the middle of the ocean now because we've messed up the world. This is a very classic theme in science fiction, right? We mess things up, here's the consequence. And she loves living on her trash pile. She thinks it's great. She doesn't know why people want something else. She likes to live with what she has. She's living. And part of the plot is they're trying to do something that might harm their current home to try and find something that might not even exist. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the optimism of Tetley. Not even the optimism, just like the happy realism, if that makes sense. Okay, these next 4 are pretty much all-time faves for me. So this next category, I don't know if I should find a better word for it, but I'm calling it feelings. Do you like to feel things when you read? Are you emotional? Do you like to have your heartstrings pulled? Not like in a romance plot type of way, in like a, oh my god, I'm crying kind of way. The first one of that is The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This one actually, it has a lot of very common science fiction tropes packaged in a way that is very unique. So you have long-term travel in space, we have the fall of Earth, we have corporate control of the galaxy, we have capitalistic extortion of individuals. We've got a lot of the classics in this book. You also have coming of age. You also have some parts of humanity that have attained almost like larger than life powers. That's always like, it has a lot of things that pop up all over the place in science fiction, but in a very palatable way. I actually don't feel like anyone could read this book if they wanted to, if they like the writing style. If they like the story being told, I don't think there is a barrier of jargon, I guess is what I would say. It's hard to describe the plot of it though, even though it's so short, because you kind of spoil it if you do that. So what I can say is it's beautiful. It makes me feel things. It makes a lot of other people feel things. And it's also kind of written not quite in a vignette style, but it is unique in its framework for that. Your first part is like a short story. You have this letter portion. And part of that is because this was written, I think, as part of a class that Simon Jimenez was in. There is an interview for this on Evie's channel where he kind of discusses the writing project for this to some extent. But also, it feels very reminiscent to me of things like Hyperion cantos and stuff like that. So, it's very good. Makes me feel things. Another one made me feel a lot of things is Light from Uncommon Stars. Yeah, I get very emotional with this one. And this one's like science fiction because there are refugee aliens. So, like, it's science fiction. It, second place for the Hugo. It's science fiction. But also, like, it has a deal with the devil. So I don't know. This is about Katrina. She's trans. She runs away from home, finds this violin mentor who is willing to mentor her, but there will be a cost of her soul to become successful. And her mentor falls in love with the alien that is running this donut shop because her family are refugees. And it's just like such a lovely found family. The love of space and location is very strong. You can tell the author's connection to this city in California is super strong. And the climax of this story is to a musical number. Music makes me so emotional. And I've never actually read a piece that basically writes along with the cadence of a song that is being performed at the same time as the character. And it's amazing. Like, amazing. This story made me pretty emotional. So I had to put it on the list. So, and if you want something that's like kind of weird, like it's contemporary, lit fic, sort of science fiction, give this one a shot. And now I have 2 short story collections, and these are classics. You've probably seen these on lists before, but they are amazing and deserving of being on this list. One is The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. Yeah, stellar. It's not all science fiction, but it has plenty of science fiction in it, and it's amazing. Absolutely amazing. And actually, it has a story that's inspired by a story in another collection by the author I'm about to bring up next, but not that collection. Which is, very circular thinking here. But I love The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. In general, a lot of his stuff is very fun science fiction. Like, I didn't put the Dandelion Dynasty on here, but in my opinion, the last 3 books of the Dandelion Dynasty are more science fiction than they are fantasy in very fun ways. But I didn't even know how to categorize that, so. And then the next short story collection I'll mention is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. It's a classic. It's my favorite. There are 2 short story collections. Story of Your Life and Others is the one that Arrival is based off of. And that collection has the documentary short story that Ken Liu used in The Paper Menagerie as inspiration. Exhalation has one of my favorite novellas of all time. It has one of the few flash fictions I like. It plays with entropy and fatalism in a way that my physics brain just eats up. So, Paper Menagerie, Ken Liu, emotional writer. You will have empathy. You will feel for characters. With Ted Chiang's style, it is a little bit more thought experiment-y, deductive, but I also had strong feelings for some of the stories. But that's like kind of the difference in the styles there, if you want to play around in short form. And I just find both of those collections to be incredibly strong. And I say that as someone who can be pretty harsh on how I rate short story collections because I read a bunch of them. But there you go, 25 books in about 25 minutes. I feel pretty good about it. And let me know if there are any books you would recommend to me based off any of these categories down below. And if you just want to leave an emoji to let me know you're here, leave a spaceship down below. And otherwise, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.